I printed out the first section of Robert Alter's translation. So if y'all remember when we talked about it last week, Robert Alter does a really good job at translating some of the poetry in Genesis. So it's not the best of translations. This is Robert Alter's translation of Genesis. I printed it out because we were going to read through it together. I have it up on the PowerPoint, but just in case it's too small to read on the TV screen, I printed it out for you to take home as well. I'm not going to print that out every week just because I feel a little bad about printing and giving out something because you have to pay for it to have it. But we are going to look at Genesis 1 and maybe small sections in the future if we really want to translate like the poetry in a section. And his translation does that better than other translations. So I'm curious who read Genesis 1 and 2 this past week? Oh, just about everyone. Wow. Okay, did anything stand out to you or seem different or new in light of some of the things we talked about, or just reading it now at a new time in your life?
They're different.
They're different?
Yeah.
What do you mean they're different? Like they have different chapter numbers?
Well, the clue is on mine, under Genesis 2, it says, another account of the creation. So that's that kind of clues you in. It's not the same as the first one.
Okay.
And on the second one, on one of them, you talked about it. I guess the first one, God talks. The second one, he just does.
Yes.
And
Okay.
also on one of them, he names everything, and the other one, the man names everything.
So you noticed quite a bit of differences between those. How did that make you feel?
I never knew it before. I mean, I've read this a long time ago, and I just kind of went, oh, okay. So they couldn't get their story straight.
All I remember growing up is the first version.
Yeah.
You know, that's all I ever remember.
Here, let me move this thing out of your way so it's not uncomfortable.
He hadn't even noticed.
This is just some different translations. These are just free resources that I printed out because I like charts. If you're curious about them. What else stood out while reading it?
One has Eve coming out of God's rib. The other one doesn't.
Yes. Okay. Mary, since you've done EFM, is there things you remember from reading it maybe before this week that stood out? What things stood out to you when the first time you ever looked at it kind of more intensely?
I just have to dovetail is that when you start a Bible study this way and you start in the beginning, and you see that there are two different versions, it kind of sets the tone for how you can read the entire rest of the Bible, because there isn't this absolute certainty of how events took place. And that opens, that really blows some people's minds, and that opens you up to reading everything else with a, And I found that most important for us from Genesis going forward.
Mm-hmm.
What else stood out about it? Well, women get the heat again. You know, it's all,
They get what?
all the heat. Oh, it was that woman's fault.
Okay. Oh, we're not getting to Genesis 3 yet.
Oh,
It doesn't exist yet.
Just wanted to, okay.
Hasn't been written. We don't know what Genesis 3 is.
Okay, never mind. Just wait for next week. And we'll start bashing women.
What about on this side of the room? Anything stand out to you while reading it this week?
I agree, the differences. Two different stories.
So, yeah, there are some differences. We're going to get to that at the end of today, possibly, or the beginning of next week. So my hope for today is that we're going to look at chapter 1 and then the very first part of chapter 2, because those go together in one segment. So the first couple verses of chapter 2, when the past 2 weeks we talked about different sources and segments that all went together and were compiled. They go together, and it really messes up Genesis when you split them apart. So we're going to keep them together as we read it. I wanted you to read chapter 2, though, because if we have time at the end, we're going to look at those differences in chapters 1 and 2. And remember what we talked about in this class, it doesn't mean that they're competing stories, they're complementary stories, and they go together, and they're showing us different sides of God and different sides of the world. And when we get to it next week, when we go deeper into chapters 2 and 3, we're going to compare those to the story, the Epic of Gilgamesh. This morning, we're going to look at more in depth of the story of Enki, which in the first week was that little 2-minute video that we had showed. We're going to look at it a little bit more in depth this time. And they're called the 7 tablets of creation, I think is what it is. It's this really old Babylonian tablet. But what we're going to look at today for chapter 1, we're going to look at the poetic structure in chapter 1. We're going to look at our comparative myth, which today is the story of Enki. And then we're going to look at some modern interpretations of Genesis. And so if you have the questions, why are we reading Genesis like this when the world was literally created in 7 days? Wait till the end, because we're going to get there, and we'll talk about that. The first thing that I wanted to do was just read Genesis from the Robert Alter translation. So I printed that out. What I'm going to ask is to do what we do in lectionary class, if you've been in it with us before. So Connie, I'll ask you to start, and we'll wait just a moment because Marilyn's here.
Okay,
I'll let her in. Oh no, we were just getting ready to start Genesis 1.
Marilyn, you got a chair right over here.
So
And hand up. Here.
the way that I like to read things when we read large chunks is every person just read until you feel tired of reading, whether that be one word, one verse, or the whole thing if you feel like it, if you're really on a roll. Or if you're feeling kind of yeah. And so, Connie, if you wouldn't mind just starting.
Okay. When God began to create heaven and earth, and the earth then was welter and waste and darkness over the deep, and God's breath hovering over the waters, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And it was evening, and it was morning, first day. And God said, "Let there be a vault in the midst of the waters, and let it divide water from water." And God made the vault, and it divided the water beneath the vault from the water above the vault. And so it was. And God called the vault heavens. And it was evening, and it was morning, second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered in one place, so that the dry land will appear." And so it was. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Go ahead.
And God said, "Let the earth grow grass, plants yielding seed of each kind, and trees bearing fruit of each kind, that has its seed within." And so it was. And the earth put forth grass, plants yielding seed of each kind, and trees bearing fruit that had its seed within each of its kind. And God saw that it was good. And it was evening, and it was morning, third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the heavens to divide the day from the night. And they shall be signs for the fixed times and for days and years. And they shall be lights in the vault of the heavens to light up the earth." And so it was.
And God made the 2 great lights, the great light for dominion of day, and the small light for the dominion of night, and the stars. And God placed them in the vault of the heavens to light up the earth, and to have dominion over day and night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And it was evening, and it was morning, fourth day. And God said, Let the water swarm with the swarm of living creatures, and let fowl fly over the earth across the vault of the heavens. And God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that crawls, which the water has swarmed forth of each kind, and the winged fowl of each kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the water in the seas, and let the fowl multiply in the earth. And it was evening, and it was morning, this day. Pass it on.
And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures of each kind, cattle and crawling things, and wild beasts of each kind. And so it was. And God made wild beasts of each kind, and cattle of every kind, and crawling things on the ground of each kind. And God saw that it was good. And God said, Let us make a human in our image, by our likeness, to hold sway over the fish of the sea, and the fowl of the heavens, and the cattle, and all beasts, and all the crawling things that crawl upon the earth. And God created the human in his image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them.
And God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and conquer it, and hold sway over the fish of the sea, and the fowl of the heavens, and every beast that crawls upon the earth. And God said, Look, I have given you every seed-bearing plant on the face of all the earth, and every tree that has fruit bearing seed, yours they will be for food.
And to all the beasts of the earth, and to all the fowl of the heavens, and to all that crawls on the earth, which has the breath of life within it, the green plants for food. And so it was. And God saw all that he had done, and look, it was very good. And it was evening, and it was morning, the sixth day.
Then the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their array. And God completed on the seventh day the work he had done, and he ceased on the seventh day from all the work he had done. And God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it. For on it he created from all his work that he had done.
I want y'all to say that. So, I'm curious, after reading this, in this other translation, that might sound a little different than translations that you're used to, if anything stood out while reading it.
Well, I thought it was weird. I can't quite figure out. You have water, they makes a dome, and you have water on top, so they must make the sky with water.
Yes. So that was one thing we talked about in our first week, and I'll go ahead and skip it because I thought it might pop back up. So remember when we talked about that ancient cosmology, or the way that the earth was made? This one's a little complicated. Here's my simpler version. So kind of this ancient way of thinking, and this goes back to the myth that we'll read of Enki, is that there's this water that's this kind of eternal, formless void of water that exists. And so when God comes in, he puts a firmament. A lot of your translations, you might have heard that, or a dome, or a vault. And God separates that water below and that water above. And the first 3 days of creation are kind of spent forming this voidless or formless water. And so first you push the water up and down, and that's where you get sky. And then you push the waters apart and you get land. But yeah, there's waters above and there's waters below. And then this one's a little more elaborate. But sometimes when you read in the Psalms or in Isaiah, you'll hear about the pillars that hold up the earth. So these are those pillars reaching down, or Sheol, this place of the dead that's underneath, kind of here by the water. And there's the floodgates. And so when we get to Genesis 6, the floodgates are opened, and all this water from up here comes crashing down and destroys. So that's this ancient cosmology. It wasn't unique to the Jews. It was throughout Canaan and Mesopotamia as well. different way of viewing the physical world, though, than we would view it. Oh, and then what's interesting is that here, kind of in the sky, is the sun and the moon and the stars are floating. And some of them, even this firmament would have holes in it, and that's kind of the light shining through when you see stars. These are better pictures than we had on the first week. I'm going to jump back here to our... Did anything else stand out when you were reading this?
I think that it was very egocentric.
Very egocentric. What does that mean?
It's
Or how do you mean it, at
It's
least?
like Copernicus was the one that said, before then, they felt everything revolved around the earth.
Uh-huh.
And then he said, no, we revolve around the sun and all that. Well, this Genesis kind of hits me the same way that, you know, man is made in God's image.
Uh-huh.
He's the one that names everything. You know, he's kind of the ruler of it all.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's very self-serving. I mean,
Okay.
that may be true, but it's slanted.
It's slanted.
Yeah, it's biased.
Okay, interesting. I want to hold on to that because we might come back to those statements when we jump into chapter 2. Did anything else stand out reading this other kind of poetic translation? Bill, I heard you get caught up on a word because it didn't sound right when you were reading. It was, and God said, let us create human. And then male and female, he created them. It jumped to the singular. And it sounded like you almost tried to fix it because it was wrong in this translation. That follows the Hebrew. God creates a singular human, but then describes the singular human as male and female and uses a plural pronoun. Kind of a strange grammar there. It seems odd.
I don't think it's as poetic as the...
Which translation do you have?
RSV. I find firmament a much more poetic word than vault.
Some of the words he uses, I feel like they're like using vault, and some of the other things he does is just to make it sound different. One place where it really does stand out is on his. So the NRSV just uses, I think it just says, how is verse 2 translated?
The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. What is welter?
So in Hebrew, there is these two words, welter and waste is how he translated it. I will suggest to you to translate it wild and waste in a few slides. I'm going to change his translation to use that.
So would it be equivalent to form and void?
Yeah, a formless void.
See, that's much more poetic to me.
He stretches it out because in Hebrew they rhyme, which is well, we're actually jumping into our poetry, so we'll go ahead and jump there. They rhyme in Hebrew, which is a very strange for Hebrew to rhyme or to kind of make the letters match up. That's not a common poetry tactic. But there's this idea of it's formless or wild, and then it's void or empty or waste. And so...
Welter and waste also goes back to early English and medieval English. Welter doesn't quite translate the wild. It's more... It would be something wilder than formless, but not wild like we think of as it's a very, I don't know how to describe it. I find it very poetic because welter is this state that's not quite formless, but not quite wild. It's this
aimlessness?
Overwhelming sense of stuff, but it's not.
Like energy?
Yeah, probably more like energy that is both wild, but at the same time, it's hard for us to discern it's what it is, but it's not empty.
I never heard the word welter until preparing for this class. I bought Genesis. So I didn't even hear that word until about a month ago. I'm glad that you said it was different than wild, though.
What confuses me is because this sounds like in the beginning there was something.
Yes.
Okay, and God, it's like, wait a minute. Thought this all started with God, you know? But in the beginning there was something already there.
Yeah.
there is this deep in this water, that primordial water that kind of exists. But like you're saying, it's not ordered. And so when God comes in, we make order out of chaos. What we're going to see kind of through Genesis 2 is that same idea. There is chaos throughout all of creation, if you will. And part of, like, God begins creation, but humanity continues creation. And so as the garden is, God kind of spreads the order into the garden. And then humanity is almost like spreading that order in that garden out. That's jumping ahead.
So where did God come from?
Right, of course, that's a good question.
Let the mystery be.
So if you remember when we talked in the beginning about this kind of rabbi tradition of arguing, there are some fun conversations, I'll say, about the relationship between God and something else existing. And so as Christians hold this idea of ex nihilo, which is that God created something out of nothing, is what ex nihilo means. It's Latin. That idea isn't exactly a Jewish idea all the time, where that there might be this kind of, they're not as strict about it. And so for them, matter is important, and it exists in the same way that spiritual life exists. When we get to chapter 2, we'll touch on that a little bit more. But there's this idea that it doesn't really matter because it was unordered. And so God comes in and begins to make something out of nothing.
That part I understand.
Yeah, but where does God come from? That's a great question.
I think that whole thing about welter and waste, or formless and void, but then when you talk about the water and the firmament, in a way it all harkens back to what we now understand as a Big Bang in a different way of understanding. It makes it seem not so, we all think about the world in ways that still are remarkably similar, even though we think of ourselves as far more advanced and different. There are themes in our understanding that we can't escape. And this ties into that.
So at the end of our chapter 1, we're going to jump to modern interpretations. I want you to hold on to your comment.
Okay.
So John, still hold on to yours when we get to chapter 2 about
Which one?
human-centric.
Okay.
People are all that. Mardell, hold on to yours about Big Bang.
Okay.
First, though, I want to jump into some of the poetic structure of Genesis. So this is the way I'm going to outline Genesis 1 and then that first part of chapter 2 for us. So it starts with these 4 different lines. When God began to create the heavens and the earth, just as a comment about those, in the Hebrew, heavens doesn't really mean ethereal place where God lives. It means sky, so it's the stuff up there. And earth is just the word for land. It's the stuff down here. And so, again, we're talking about there was something there and God begins to order it. And so we order the up there stuff and we order the down here stuff. The earth was a complete chaos. And so there's those words that welter or waste or wild and waste or a formless void. And there's darkness that covers the face of the deep. Again, those deep is that primordial water that's always been there. And a wind from God began to sweep over the face of the waters. And that word wind is a Hebrew word ruach, if you've ever heard that word before. And it's the word that's translated in the Old Testament as spirit or as breath or as a wind or as the presence of God.
Is that the
And so-
same as Ruach?
Yes, yeah. And so these are the first kind of couple of verses here. And then we're going to get into this next segment. So these are the days of creation. And I want you to look at the way I try to differentiate. It begins with God separating. So at first, God separates light, and that makes day and night. Then God separates the waters. So he makes the waters, this is my way of saying below and above. So I was running out of space on the slide. God separates the waters below and the waters above, and that's what we call sky. And different translations might say dome or vault or a firmament. But these first 3 days have to do with separation. So it's a little different than we think of. There was nothing there and you just make something. There's this unchaotic void and God separates to make order out of it. And that gets this idea that it was wild or it was welter. But then, if you'll notice about these things, that they're still empty. And so then God begins to fill them. And so then God orders and fills the light. So he makes the sun and the moon and the stars. And then God orders the waters or fills the waters. So he makes sea creatures. And then God orders the land. And so that's when animals and humans come from. What's really cool about this is that they correspond to each other. And I'll show that just a little better on the next slide. And then there's this really special line that starts with chapter 2. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished in all their multitude. If you remember the King James Version, you might say, thus completed the generations of the heavens and the earth. That's a really special line, and it's going to pop up throughout all of the book of Genesis. And I think it happens 10 times, if I remember correctly, and it kind of sets up these different stages as you're going to read through Genesis. And then the last one is God rests. That seventh day, God rests. One thing to note about Genesis 1, it's really highly poetic. Genesis 2 is not. Genesis 2 is just like a narrative, and it's like a narrator's telling you the story of what happened. Genesis 1, it's deeply, deeply poetic. There's rhyme in it, which is it's an odd form of Hebrew poetry. There's this meter, and there's lots and lots of parallels. That is a really common way of doing Hebrew poetry. And there's this idea of 7 that keeps popping up throughout it. This slide is about to get a little chaotic as we kind of go through and begin to look at it. So this is a simplified version of what we just looked at. But I ordered the different days, 1, 2, and 3, 4, 5, and 6, and those are their verse numbers. So if you remember, there was the light and the day, the waters above and below. Somebody help me out, what's here, the land?
Sky?
Yeah, that's day 2, right? Am I remembering this right? Day 3 is heavens, or is the land. What happens in day 4? Sun, moon, stars.
Lights.
Day 5?
Living creatures. Water.
Sea creatures. Day 6?
Human. Land creatures.
Land creatures and humans. Yeah. Woo. Now, this chart's going to get a little crazy because we're going to throw some lines on here. So this idea of wild and waste, the lines are going to go away in a second. Those correspond, they kind of set this outline of the way God creates. And so the first idea is the earth is welter, or the earth is wild, the earth is formless. And so the first thing that we're going to begin to see is God forms the earth. So we form it by ordering everything. We separate the light, we separate the waters, we separate the water above and below, and we separate it apart to make land. And then God, it's waste, or it's empty, it's void, as some translations say. And then God fills those things. So it's this really kind of poetic structure that follows through. I'm just going to get rid of the lines so it's easier to read. But there's also a lot more poetry that comes about. Of each of the days of creation, it begins, and God said, and then it ends, it was evening and it was morning. Does evening and morning sound strange to you?
Perhaps reversed, usually it's morning and evening.
Yeah, they're saying it weird.
It really resonated with me more so.
But they're
Tell me why.
Well, for one thing, the Jewish calendar still
Okay, yeah.
begins in the evening. And if the creation started with darkness, I
Oh,
thought,
interesting.
how did we make this transition from thinking the brightness, morning is the beginning of everything, when actually we're saying, there's this saying that the darkness, even the formless and void, is the place that everything springs out of. To me, all of this is created out of darkness. And by saying evening and morning is the day, we are remembering that the darkness is what gives life to all of the day that we celebrate, as opposed to the way we look at it today, where the darkness is the end and the death of all that we celebrate. To me, it's a different way of looking at.
Interesting.
I look at it as transition.
As a transition?
Evening is the transition between light and dark. Morning is the transition between dark and light.
Interesting. Marilyn?
Well, there's a footnote in this Bible. It says, since the Jewish day began at sundown, the order is evening and morning.
It sounds strange to us when we read it. It's a different way but what's interesting most about it is these two phrases set off every single part of the days. And so they're these very poetically structured times. And God said, and it was evening and morning, the first day, the second day, the third day, the fourth day, fifth day, sixth day. And there's this other phrase that it ends by saying it? Did you catch a word that was repeated throughout?
Good.
Good.
It was good.
And very good.
And then the sixth day is very good because people showed up. And people just make everything better, especially
Not according to
creation.
the Sumerians.
And people sort of wrote this, so
Just saying.
a little bias maybe there.
The other thing I want to point out, and to me this is what I find to be really, really fascinating, is this idea of sevens. And so another idea we're going to see throughout the Bible is that numbers are important. 7 is one of those numbers. Does anyone know what 7 tends to represent? It's kind of this idea of perfection or wholeness is what 7 will represent a lot. So you get this idea of 7 repeated. There's 7 days of creation. There's 7 times that good is repeated. And then what's really fascinating is that when you start, verse 1 has 7 words in it. Verse 2 has 2 sets of 7 in it. Every part of creation has another 2 sets of 7 repeated. So there's 14 words in it. And then the last little section that you get, there's 3 sets of 7 that get repeated in it. 7 is a number that gets weaved in and out. I think John, I may have mentioned this to you, or it might have been Bill. I don't know. I think it was one of you too. But in the genealogy in Matthew, there's this other set of 7 that gets repeated. And when we get to a genealogy coming up in a few chapters, Matthew takes that genealogy and takes out some pieces and even adds some other names to make it match 7. And he does it 3 different times. He has 2 sets of 7 3 times. So there's 14 little generations. 7 is one of those numbers that gets woven in and out that to us seems really random, but it makes something well ordered. It's telling you I'm poetic and I'm important and I'm creating wholeness. So what we get when we read Genesis 1 is that the earth in creation, it's good. In fact, it's very good. People belong on the earth. People are good for the earth. People are good. And creation is good. It's whole. It's complete. And there's kind of this uniqueness about it. And even more than that, do you remember how day 7, what is day 7? The day of rest. We are still in that day of rest or harmony is the idea in Genesis 7. That we were meant to live in this kind of perfect little bubble of creation. We bumble around in the garden, we pick fruits and things like that, but it's this goodness, and we're still resting in that goodness. That idea, by the way, has been picked up by Christians. Has anyone paid attention to how many sides are on our font?
7.
It's actually 8. It's not 7. So in the early church, they talked a lot about this 8th day of creation. And that's because, the 7th day didn't work out too far, as we look at it, or didn't work too well. It didn't last very long as we kind of move away through Genesis. But that God's recreating and making all things new. And so there's this idea that of recreation, where God's going to restore us to this. The early church called that the 8th day. And that's what we look forward to, is this 8th day. And so our baptism font has 8 sides, because you're baptized into that 8th day, this resurrection when the world's well ordered again. That's not relevant to Genesis. I just think it's cool. When you look at this poetic structure, what do you think about that? Do you think the number 7 is kind of random? Is that stretching it a little too far to try to make up multiples of 7 in here? Did you say yeah?
I mean, you've got all these 7s in the words, but there's so many different translations. And if you're reading it from the Torah from the very beginning, and then it divides into 7s, then okay. But it just seems a little too orderly for me, for the way in which the Bible was created, with many authors and many.
And does every translation come out
No,
like
this is
that?
in Hebrew,
So this
not
will just be
in.
the Hebrew translation.
This is in Hebrew. And one of the things that we looked at is, so if you remember back to our sources, that Genesis 1 is the priestly source, and that is one of the last things that are written. And so what we know about Genesis 1 from some of the word structure that's in here, from the type of poetry that's used and the language that's used, This was probably one of the last parts of the Bible that gets written. This is probably written post-exilic, and it may have had earlier visions, but it gets refined and refined and refined into the version that we have now. And so it might have taken a long time to get it so well put. But this isn't a very early thing. This was what was like finally completed. And so this is like the perfection of Hebrew poetry and of storytelling for centuries finally gets like put to this.
Sort of like the cherry on top of the sundae. Right?
Very much so. And then they throw it right at the very beginning so you can't miss it.
But aren't most things that are written, not written, but are oral histories, and even with a child's nursery rhymes, you know, there's a beat, there's a cadence, there are repeated words and whatnot. So is that not part of what this is? That makes it easier to remember, recall, and be able to, you know, have something relatively consistent.
Very, very much so. And another thing to remember is when something gets written down, paper is really, really expensive. And so you don't write worthless things down. And so it's very well refined by the time it gets put in a version that you're going to keep or carve into clay or whatever it is. All right, we're going to move from the poetic structure. Oh, yeah. I always have, okay, when I ever like throw something out like this, it's so I don't forget it. Because I always know I'm going to forget it when I practice. So the other part I wanted to pull out, and Bill, I think you read this verse. It's this kind of, it's the middle of it. And this is one of the first poems that you could call in the Bible. And it's, so God created humans in his image, or human, if you want to follow the Hebrew, it's singular. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. This is kind of a section that stands out when you read it. In a lot of translations, like if you're reading in an NRSV, it's in its own little segment, and it might be kind of centered together to help you pay attention to it. But I wanted to point that out, and there's some other fun poetry things, but what stands out in this is, in the image of God, he created them. That's the center of this poem, and the part that you remember. That makes humans pretty special. We weren't made from leftover God. We were made in the very image of God. When we move in a second, we're going to see Enki's creation story and how that's being made in the image of God is pretty special. But I did want to ask, what do you think it means to be made in God's image?
Well, I think it's problematic because we so project our own humanity onto God. And that phrase could be one of the reasons we do that. That we actually think we can imagine God, but in the Jewish tradition, very much you don't think of God. You know, if you actually try to, if you were to see God, you would be wiped out. I mean, right?
Yeah.
What does the word image mean? Is it something visual, or is it something? Does it stand for something else?
So in the Ten Commandments, the word for idol is the same word as image.
Really?
When we'll get in a second. So Marilyn, you touched on something important. This might mean something more than just a physical depiction. So this might not be saying we look like God. It might be saying something else. And even in a Jewish mindset, it would be impossible to think that this even means a physical representation of God. So what does image mean, if it might be something more than physical?
An idea.
An idea?
Mm-hmm. Spiritual? Yes.
What do you mean by spiritual?
In thought.
Okay.
You want to be like God. I mean, we're strong to be as close as we can be to perfection of God.
So maybe it's that we have the same like purity as God kind of thing, or holiness?
Well, I like that, you know, the wind was the spirit.
Yeah.
And I like thinking that wind can be within you, and that spirit, that part of it, and it can be formed and reformed.
Mhm.
So,
I guess you could substitute likeness. But still.
it seems visual.
What do you think?
Yeah.
Well, one thing that image means, well, and there are lots of good Christian answers to it, but I'll give you one historical answer, and then we'll talk about what that might mean. So, sometimes a king, when he would want to assert his own authority in a place, would send out an image bearer to go out after him, or like an idol, so something depicting his face. We're Americans, we take flags. That's the American image. And so when we wanted to claim the moon, we put the flag there and we said, this is now American. And we're going to recognize it as ours, or however you want to think of that story. Kings would do that of old. They would, if you're the Romans, you would put your eagle there, or if you were another nation, you would put some kind of likeness of that king, and it represented that king's authority being there, even though the king wasn't physically present. And so his image bearers would go out, and they're carrying that king's authority. And so kind of very just simply, part of being created in the image of God means in some way you bear God's own authority and presence wherever you go. That becomes really special for humans. That doesn't get stated about humanity and other creationness. You are the representatives of God. You are the evangelists of God, going out and speaking on behalf of God. So it's a really high sense of what it means to be human. Although what people have thought about that is that the idea that we are made in the image of God, in some way I share in the likeness of God, which was a word that you had used over here, in the way that we can think a lot more than the animals around us. And so as being made in the image of God means I kind of in some way have this reason from God. In Genesis 1, there is how does God create in Genesis 1?
He speaks.
God speaks. In Greek, there's this word that gets translated as speak, and it's reflected here in Genesis 1 in Septuagint. That's logos. Have you heard the word logos before? And logos,
word?
it gets translated as word, but it's reason. Yes, reason. And the main thing we see about God in Genesis 1 and what we hear about God is this logos, this word and this reason. And so a lot of people have correlated that logos or that reason as something that people have. And so we can think about God in new ways and understand God and God's own creation. So we can do science. Yay. But when I think of the image of God, I think about it in those two senses. In some way, I can understand God, both when I study Scripture and when I look out around the world. But also, I think more so as we as people, we are carrying something of God. And that's a big responsibility. But we are here on earth to kind of spread the presence of God, or the kingdom of God, or the garden of God. So you can look back here.
It's kind of like, too, we say that your body is the temple of God.
Very
and
much
so. It's
so.
the reflecting inside that you've got to take care of this body.
Mm-hmm.
There's a power element to that too.
A power element. Tell me about that.
Well, God created, and if we're in the image of God, then we have the ability to create too. But God destroyed, and we have the ability to destroy too.
Oh, and that's scary.
It is.
But that hasn't come up yet in Genesis 1. That happens to us later.
With destruction?
Yeah.
Yeah. But we learn from a very young age.
Yeah.
A very young age we can destroy. Last night I was trying to keep the house nice and tidy. I did not want to have to clean up after Poppy this morning. About every 20 minutes I spent just cleaning up every little thing that she did. And she broke every single crown in her coloring pot. I'm like, why?
Because she could.
Because she could, yeah. Look what I can do. I can assert my will on this crown. So moving past the poetic structure and kind of the outline of Genesis 1, and I hope you remember some of those things when you go back and read Genesis in the future. You form and you fill. It makes it really special. I want to take a moment to look at some comparative myths. And so, man, we are not going to read all of this.
Thank you.
So there is this creation myth about Elis, or Elis, I don't know how you say his name. But this is from Sumeria or Babylon in Assyria, so up there in Mesopotamia. This is one of the oldest creation myths that we have discovered, at least, and that was pretty widely spread out. So Unima Ellis, or however you say it, it means when on high. It's the first couple of words there. So we discovered it in the mid-1800s, and that's when we were kind of able to translate it. But we date it to its earliest writing when we found it to the 12th century BCE. But based on some of the language and the words that are used in it, we think it's as early as the 17th century BCE. Really, really old, which is pretty cool. There's also 4 kind of different text versions of it that are floating around. They're all pretty similar, but there might be a couple of differences in them. But just to know about it, there's 7 tablets. It's really, really long. I put a summary of it, so when I send the notes out, you're welcome to read it. But the part that I wanted to just stand out, and we mentioned it the first week, is that there's a series of gods, and they fight each other. And the part that our story comes up is there's this god called Tiamat, and her son, Enki. If you remember him, we watched the story about Enki. Enki fights against Tiamat, and he wins. And this is this paragraph up here. And so Enki takes Tiamat and, just kind of rips her in half. And he puts part of Tiamat up in the sky, and he puts the other part of Tiamat down below. And that's where you get the sky, or that vault holding up the waters, all up there. And the other half, he pushes out into land, and that's what holds those waters down their back. So that makes the sky and the land. And then out of her corpse, Marduk pops up, and Marduk is the main god for Assyria. That's where you create the heaven and the earth. And you get, so out of Tiamat, that's where the Tigris and the Euphrates flow. What's also really cool about kind of this story is that there's these 4 winds that blow, and those kind of correspond to the 4 rivers that you see in Genesis 1. And there's kind of the 4 corners of the earth that they flow to. But what really stands out in this story is that the world's created through death, destruction, and violence, and chaos. So that's how the world is created. You kill and you use the dead body of a god to make the world. The water you drink from is like the dead remains of another god. And the way that humanity is created essentially is the gods are bored and they need something to do. So they kill another god, and out of his blood, that's where humans come from. And humans aren't good here because they're like the worst. We're the blood of the worst god. And if you remember the first week when we looked at the story of Enki, essentially the humans were so feeble and pathetic that they sent a flood to just wipe out all of humanity because they were just so dumb. They weren't even worth keeping. And so we just needed to start over because we're bored and we still need a toy to play with. This is the main kind of comparative myth that Genesis 1 is competing with. So we did this on the first day, but I want to bring it back up now that we've kind of looked at Genesis 1 a little bit more in depth. What stands out? What's different in these myths?
It's very violent.
Very violent. Very much so.
This sounds to me like a Greek thought process, because the Greeks thought Zeus and all these were fighting, and
Yeah.
That sounds very Greek. So I guess the Greeks got it from the Sumerians.
Well, so you bring up a good point. Whose story is different? The one in the Bible, or all these different ones with lots of gods fighting?
God's fighting.
The one that's different is ours.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Everyone else has gods fighting, and they have series of God killing each other, and there's generations of gods. Ours is different. There's one God, always existed, always been there since the very beginning, and we didn't fight to create. God speaks to create, and it's good. And so this is one of the oldest creation myths, but everyone else sounds a lot like this. Ours sounds a lot like it too, but it sounds very different.
Ours is different, but that's the thing I think I like about welter and waste. Welter and waste is still, it's not formless and void.
Mm-hmm.
Formless and void, to me, sounds very quiet and empty. Welter and waste is not. So God is taking our story that God is peacefully, but he's still
Yeah.
making it out of a violent, roiling kind of
Yeah.
formless thing.
I like that.
Alexander, when you say it's one of the oldest creation myth, you said it earlier, but I'm hard of hearing. About how old is it?
So, let me come back to my slide. Oh, there we go. It is, so the written text, 12th century BCE. But we think it came from the 17th century. But we don't have a written version that's old. We think that because essentially Marduk, who pops up as a pretty big character in a lot of the versions of these stories, he was really popular back then in some of the cities that are mentioned in the story. Would we have other written sources from back then that it seems like it kind of was written down in the 17th century, but the written 12th century.
What is the mid-1800s? I missed that.
That was when we found and translated this.
Oh.
And what we're going to find too for a lot of biblical scholarship, 18th centuries, that's when we finally got good at archaeology and translating things, and our view of the Bible changed. So our first week we looked at when the different sources kind of begin to get popularized, 18th century. When different views of interpreting Genesis pop up is the 18th century. So that's really when the world begins to change into the modern era, which we're about to touch on here in our next slide. So I know I asked this in the first week, but does looking at this other story make you uncomfortable?
No.
All civilizations have creation stories. And they're not the same.
No, they're not the same. Now, John, I want to come back to where we had started. You said it's so human-centric. Do you think in light of, if this is what you're told, is that humanity is a mistake? You're kind of made from the worst of the gods' blood, and you're just feeble, and you're really just a plaything. Does the story in Genesis 1 and 2 seem any more special?
Sure does, yeah.
It does to me. It makes me feel like I'm not pointless. And, you know, in this story, humanity was also made to kind of tend the garden, if you will, to take care of it. But again, it's more like a servant than like a co-creator with God, which is what we see in Genesis 2 when we get to it. All right, we're going to jump now and, yes, okay. That comes from it's an article by J.J. Mark, and it's called The Babylonian Epic of Creation, and it was in the World History Encyclopedia. If you want to find it online, you can go to World History Encyclopedia and just type in Unima Elish, or however you say that, and you will find it. It's also in the text, but there's more information about the tablets and all of that as well. All right, we're going to look at some modern interpretations of Genesis, and we are not going to make it to chapter 2, so we're just going to finish this section, and we'll do chapter 2 next week. I wanted to tell you one part. So for most of Christians reading the Bible, they use an interpretive method called four senses. Has anyone ever heard of those before? No. Oh, this is exciting. I get to teach you something new. Oh, I'm so excited. So the way that they would look at the Bible is they would read it and they would say, okay, what is the literal interpretation? And that doesn't mean literal in the same sense that we tend to think of literal. It just means, what is this story saying when the author wrote it, is what literal would mean. And then they would look at it as this allegorical interpretation. So then they would kind of read it in light of all of Scripture and what we know about Jesus and what God is doing in all of creation. How do I read this story now? And then they would go back and they would look at a moral interpretation. So what moral lessons do I learn when I read this? And then they would go back and read an analogical, which that kind of has to do with what is the spiritual meaning or the Christological meaning or what is the prophetic meaning of this text. That didn't mean that everything that they read had all four ideas, but this was the eyes that they would look at when they would read Scripture. What is the literal, allegorical, moral, and the analogical meaning of this thing? And again, literal is just what the author is saying. Today, we tend to not look at the last two. Mainly we look at this first one. What did the author mean when they write this? We might also ask, what is the Christological meaning, especially if it's like the Psalms? We tend to ignore what the author meant and only take the allegorical sense. But I think it's interesting to know that throughout history, Christians have read Scripture differently. And especially Jews read Scripture differently. So when it comes to reading Genesis, I just think that that's helpful to know, is that the hats that we use, when we put our scholar hats on, we're usually asking that first question, what did the author mean? But there's lots of different hats that you can wear. But we're going to look at some of those modern hats and at least understandings of Genesis. But before we do so, I wanted to read this quote from St. Augustine, which, actually, Connie, since you're closest, would you mind reading that?
When we reflect upon the first establishment of creatures in the works of God from which he rested on the seventh day, we should not think either of those days as being like these ones, governed by the sun, nor of that working as resembling the way God now works in time, but we should reflect rather upon the work from which times began, the work of making all things at once, simultaneously.
I know that might be complicated reading it because it's an excerpt. So we're going to look at this next slide that's a little easier to understand it. So essentially, Augustine was arguing against reading Genesis 1 as being a literal 7 days of creation. The reason that he does so is he says, you can't limit God. That it can't take God 7 days to create. God created things all at once, which kind of goes back, Mardell, what you were talking about of it sounds like a big bang and things created all at once. But he gets kind of harsh in some of his statements, so there's a longer excerpt in the paper. But this is what he says. Usually even a non-Christian knows something about the earth, and he goes on to talk about how the planets and the sun and the stars move and everything. Now, it is a disgraceful and dangerous thing for an infidel to hear a Christian, presumably giving the meaning of Scripture, talking nonsense on these subjects. And kind of what Augustine was doing was talking about the scientific understanding of the day, and which in the 4th century, or the 3rd century, they kind of knew that everything was created at once, what we would today say is a Big Bang. And he was arguing against Christians fighting against that sense for two reasons. One, because it made them sound dumb. And secondly, because it limits the way God creates. And if God is all powerful, then God would speak everything kind of all at once. So,
and yet people still believe?
And people do. And we're going to look at, on our next slide, just different ways. Not that one is better or one is worse. There are different ways. But what people think today when we talk like this, it sounds like, well, you're just a 21st century liberal Christian and you don't care about the Bible. No, it's actually kind of been like that since the very beginning. So it's not an old argument.
Doesn't Augustine then tie into the same thing, back to the Big Bang or a single thing, but we now slowly are understanding. I mean, we think of time as a fixed thing that we can understand, and that a second is this brief moment.
Yeah.
And we can't imagine 1/10,000th of a second, let's say. But in physics and in science, we also know that 1/10,000th of a second is still an infinity in sense of time that we don't understand. So Augustine is talking about something we're still figuring out and still kind of learning from a scientific perspective that we can't, that our understanding of time is the part that's narrow.
Yeah.
It's not time itself or day or...
That was complex. I want to be respectful of time, so we're going to just finish this slide and we're going to stop after this. Man, we had so many more things I was going to talk about. That's okay. So I just wanted to tell you just very quickly, in light of what we read, so these are typical ways people would read these things throughout time and then today. One of those is young earth creationism, so that's how I grew up. If you've ever heard of the Creation Museum or Ken Ham, really popularized this way of reading scripture, which is that the 6 or 7 days of creation were literal 24-hour days in a literal 7-day week. And that corresponding to this kind of theory, the earth is around 6,000 years old. And so back in the beginning of time, there was an actual bubble of water around the earth that was like this hydrosphere, and it made oxygen really rich. So dinosaurs are just big lizards because there was more oxygen, and humans lived longer because the oxygen-rich environment made them Superman or something. And kind of different things like that. So that's young earth creationism. But kind of what it's rooted is that these are literal 24-hour segment days that you read in Genesis. That's not the perspective that I take. What I found, most people here are in mainline churches are old earth creationists. So one unpopular theory today is called the gap theory. And that is essentially God, the first line in Genesis, God creates like light. And that's like the Big Bang. And then there's this gap. And so like 14 billion or 12, whatever billion years pass. And then suddenly the earth is there. And then kind of God moves in and begins to order creation at that point. That's not as much of a popular theory anymore. What is, though, is what people call day-age theory. And that is that the descriptions in Genesis are describing ages in which God is creating. A really popular verse people will quote is, it's like, a day is something 1,000 years to God. And, what is that verse? I can't remember what it is. Or 1,000 years is as to one day, something like that. But kind of since God uses time differently, so a day just means an age. And so you're seeing an outline almost of creation. The other kind of readings are more allegorical readings. And so I was going to talk about one that's this historic analogical one. And that was one that was kind of used throughout most of human history, which is that the 7 days of creation correspond to why we have a week today. That Moses actually uses that kind of argument about creation. And that was the most popular kind of Christian argument. But today you might hear people describe themselves as theistic evolutionist or evolutionary creationist. And those kind of mean the same thing, is that they read Genesis 1 as allegorical and not having a scientific correspondence at all to the mechanisms of describing the world being created. And so they would look at kind of evolution as being a more viable explanation of describing the world, but in some way they still believe God is still involved in that, or at least that God still exists. And then I just put on the bottom, if you're like me, so one of these describes me, but I'm not going to say which, but I just say, I'm not a scientist. My job is I'm a student and a teacher of the Bible, so it's not my job to explain scientific things. My hope in all things is to just know what the Bible says. If, however, those things do interest you, there's a book I'm going to recommend for you called Adam and the Genome. So this is written by two people. One is named Dennis, the other is named Scott McKnight. You are welcome to take my copy home and look at it if people aren't going to fight for it. But Scott McKnight writes the kind of theology portion, and Dennis writes the scientific portion. I will say this, is if we're going to talk about evolution, there are issues to deal with Christian theology that might be an issue for you, they might not be. They were for me when I had my own kind of growth out of fundamentalist Christianity. And that is, what do you do about original sin, which is really tied into Genesis 3? What do you do about there being corruption before the fall or before the curse? If God created a good world, how could there have been kind of death and destruction for billions of years before that? Is the Bible inerrant? Inerrancy is a position on the Bible that it has all scientific, moral, and theological truths in it. And so there can be no scientific, moral, or theological problems or contradictions. Is the Bible infallible? Infallible means unfailing in its purpose. And so that might be to lead you to God. So how could the Bible lead you astray if it's supposed to lead you to God? And what about the inspiration of Scripture? If we're going to say that people didn't know everything when it was written, or about it developing over time. That question popped up in here. We were going to talk about that. We'll do this next week. This book answers a lot of those questions, and it gets really, really heady, and it talks about the genetics, and it's really complicated. Okay, I'm going to stop the presentation. If we want to talk about some of this, we can. That was a lot to go through. Wow, I didn't think that would take us so long.
So, do we need to read addition?